My grandparents had a lake house at Lake of the Ozarks, and I remember as a child looking down from a rather high hill on the boat as it sat and floated and bobbed around in the dock, and even back then, those are my earliest memories in life. So some of the earliest memories in life I have are of the boat and that lake, and the joy that we all had as a family being there. It was really a great experience. And my grandfather was the owner of a construction company. It was started by my great-grandfather, and they bought that boat so that they could transport people around the lake to show them real estate that they owned that was possibly for sale. It was a wonderful thing, and we have a lot of documented photograph outings in the boat, and it was just a great experience growing up with that. In fact, I'm the youngest boy of 5 children. I have a sister that's younger than I. The rest of them are all boys. And my dad, my mom, my grandfather, my grandmother, we were all intimately involved in the whole lake living thing. And, you know, it's probably a bad thing to say, but I was really spoiled, but I didn't know it. I just thought everybody had like 5 boats. And we grew up that way, and whenever we wanted to go sailing, there was a little sailboat, there was a little fishing boat, but there was the Century Coronado. And that's what everybody really gravitated to. And in fact, my grandfather at one time did not really want the boat to be used as much as it was going to be used. So he bought a little outboard, and the day that they bought that boat, they wore down the battery trying to get it started. So the Century Coronado became the mainstay all the time. That boat, as new, as ordered, with the optional hardtop and the motor that my grandfather's boat had in it, was a little less than the boat that Selah is, but probably right around $9,500. Now the Selah boat is right at $10,000. Yeah. Well, back in 1991 or so, I did look at some photographs and some color slides that my grandfather had taken of his boat when I was a child, and I pursued the state of Missouri to with the hull number, just the regular registration number, and found out that the boat still existed. And I talked to the current owner. I would like to have that boat, but he's not interested in parting with it, so I felt like it'd be great to have one of my own, so kind of just started looking around, but quickly found out that most of the boats out there that were available, even though the owners felt like they were original, were far from original, and I couldn't really afford the price that was being asked for them, especially with the thought of buying something that was supposedly original and basically having to tear it apart and put it back together again to make it original. It just became crazy. So then the look became, well, maybe you just buy something that really wasn't that great to begin with. And found one on eBay, and I was not the high bidder, but shortly after the auction ended, I was contacted by the owner, and he said that the high bidder was not able to fulfill the bid, so he asked me if I would, and of course we struck a deal, and I drove 4,408 miles round trip to Seattle, Washington, to pick up the boat that was less than desirable. But having said what I said earlier, that I was going to have to go through it all anyway, it became just the knowledge of knowing this. I was in this for the long haul, and it was going to be a big project. There's a whole lot of things memorable about that trip. The first thing I got to say is I like to drive, and I was really jazzed about the boat. And moments before I left, I was a little shook, and I approached my beloved wife, Rhonda, and I said, "Man, I just hope it's in pretty decent shape." And she says, "Really? I mean, how bad does it have to be before you turn around and come back empty-handed?" And I said, "Well, that probably is not happening." So drove 19 hours straight. Not because I really wanted to set that goal, but because I was jazzed. I really wasn't too tired or anything, and I did get a little sleep. And then the following day, pulled into town and met a gentleman, and we hooked up the boat, spent a couple hours getting the trailer lights working, and then started driving back. Well, I got back to about Utah, and the U-joint started making noise on my truck, so I had to pull over to an auto parts store and lay underneath it and replace some U-joints. But I was really interrupted constantly by the flow of people that were coming into the parking lot, and making a comment on this basic hunk of junk that was behind my truck. And some of them really had a vision for it. Very, very few people even knew what it was remotely about. But and then when I brought it home, the really exciting thing about that is we have some very, very dear friends. And they'd known for years that I was very interested in getting this particular wood boat. And they knew how excited I was, and they were excited for me. They were really jazzed about even the whole me going to get it and everything. So that boat was in the back driveway, and I brought everybody into the garage, and they were going to view the boat as the garage door went up. And I just watched my friends. I didn't really look at the boat. I'd seen it. And as that garage door went up, everybody was really standing in the garage smiling ear to ear, and the higher the door went up, the more the smiles turned down. And it was like, oh my goodness, you went to Seattle for this? Are you a bubble off yourself? This is a piece of junk. Are we going to have a bonfire? It was just hilarious. And now, of course, years later, things have changed. Well, I'm not a real man of means, so we lived comfortably, and we had just bought a house. In fact, it was only a month after we bought the house that I drove to Seattle to pick up the boat. And our backyard was just merely vacant. It was a good candidate for a pool. And after bringing back the boat, of course, there was lots of speculation about how are we going to restore this? Where are we going to restore this? And we could take it to place A, we could take it to place B, we could take it to somebody and let them do it. But that financially seemed like such a hard blow that it just didn't make good sense. So we decided, again, we knew we were in for the long haul. We spent about the next year pouring a concrete pad for a new garage, an additional garage, and in that we have some steel work so we can pick the boats up off trailers. It's heated, it's air conditioned, it has a nice storage in it. And in between the house and the garage is a network of planter boxes all covered with slate tile and indirect lighting. And these are things that my wife said, if we're going to do this, if we're going to get the garage for the shop, then I'm going to get a patio. And one of the wisest decisions ever made, because I really enjoy the patio, and it's increased the value of the house, and it made the whole experience a lot more pleasant. And because it was detached, it kept most of the dirt out there, so it was all a good thing. But that process alone basically was about a year and a half. And then I spent about a year on the motor because I wanted it done right, and I hired all the machine work out. I was more interested in it done right than being done fast, and I'm friends with a machinist, and he said he would take care of it. I had no idea it would take him a year to take care of it, but once assembled, we put that on the test card, and we have some videos of that running. That was a whole year of that. So basically the whole project from start to finish, it was a 10-year span, about 7 years worth of work on the whole boat. A year to the motor, so about 5 years on woodwork, and another year or so on chrome, trim, upholstery, paint, and things of that nature. Probably could have saved a lot more than I did, but again, we're talking about a 354 cubic inch dual quad, 275 horsepower Hemi, 1,100 pound motor swinging around in the bilge of a boat. So I didn't want to run the risk at 40 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, just thinking about 45 or 50-year-old wood between me and the end of a 7-year project. So we elected to pretty much replace almost all the wood. Now there's 3 forward frames on the hull. Those that are forward of the windshield were retained, and they're in really good shape. There are 2 frames on the deck forward of the windshield that were retained, and 2 frames on the stern deck that were retained. And all of the wood furniture inside the boat is original, with the exception of the armrest. For some reason or another, that particular piece was just toothpicks when we took the upholstery off of it. So there's about a dozen pieces total in the boat that are original. One in particular has an original hull stamping on it. Several pieces, little pieces, have hull markings and Century original markings and things like that. And some of those were elected to keep. But for the most part, all of the bottom, all of the sides, all of the deck is all brand new. eBay is a wonderful source for a lot of stuff. In fact, days after I brought the boat home from Seattle, I bought my very first part, and it was the latch that held the motor box lid onto the motor box. I don't think I've ever seen one come up, and I think it was only $2.50, but mine was broke, and there it was, so I bought that. Wood, what's used in the boat is it has Douglas fir stringers. It has predominantly white oak bottom frames, and originally it had a lot of mahogany side frames, and it has African mahogany skin both on the bottom and on the sides. The boat now has all white oak bottom with the exception of the Douglas fir stringers. It has almost all white oak side frames. It's made the boat a little bit heavier, but it's a little stiffer, and it's not a departure from what could have been done. Bought very few from long distance. I wanted to buy chines from up north because they normally come real long, but when the search was on and when the need was there, they didn't have any long material and didn't have any foresight as far as when it would come in, so we made our own, and that was quite a challenge. So the chines are one of the four pieces on the boat that are steam bent, and they're technically not steamed, they just were soaked in water a long time, and they were really wet and really green when they were installed on the boat. Both the lower transom frame and the upper transom frame were steam bent, and they came out real well. Hardware for the boat is a whole new challenge. I was grateful that the boat came with a whole lot of the original hardware, and we were able to probably fabricate a dozen parts, and we made those ourselves because this 59 and 60 year are really peculiar in their own way, and there's just not a lot to share with other boats that were made. What's traditionally done is, and we're grateful to have companies like A&A Marine. A&A Marine is usually contracted to provide Century interiors, and they do a wonderful job. Unfortunately, A&A Marine cannot research every particular boat to get the exact right color, the exact right texture. But having grown up with this boat, I knew the right colors and I knew all of the right textures, and I also knew, unfortunately, that a lot of stuff was not available. So I went on a long search, and through several phone calls and several internet late nights, I contacted a company called SMS. They're out of Utah, and they happen to have the right dyes for making the upholstery, so it was just a matter of me choosing the correct color, and they could also custom do colors. And in the end, SMS supplied me with the correct lipstick red for the smooth upholstery, the correct lipstick red perforated for the headliner of the roof and around the perimeter of each cushion, the correct white flagstone for the accent striping, the correct basket weave mylar for the dashboard and the side accents on the ceiling boards, and also the really rare 1 inch wide grooved linoleum floor. They made that. Now, once they were contracted for all those materials came to my house. I unrolled them, I inspected them, and then I packaged them back up and sent them up to A&A Marine. And they cut them to all the exact right patterns and sewed them together and sent that back to me in the form of a kit. It was probably twice, maybe 3 times the money of a regular kit, but I got all of the original textures, all of the original colors, even down to the Mylar 2-color embossed rear seat badging that nobody has reproduced. So I'm really fortunate. When we did this, we first stripped all the hardware off the boat, and of course you want to invite a bunch of people over for the flipping day. And we did that. We provided some coffee and donuts, and with about 15 friends, the boat can become upside down, which is how you want to do all your work. Once the boat's upside down, we marked places on the floor, and we shored up the hull so that it was level, straight, and true. And we marked those areas so that if the boat had to be moved or anything, it could always go back to square one, and we'd know that it was true. The next step was to strip off boards. Now you want to be real careful and not take off too many at one time, so I elected to do most of the bottom first. So we took off the first, or the chine plank, which would be the first plank on the side above the chine, and all of the bottom boards to reveal the framework. This was not a pretty sight. The boat had been underwater 1, maybe 2 or 3 times in its life, and there was a lot of debris. There were several places that had holes in the boat. You could put your finger through some of the frames, and other frames clearly were in good shape, but they were cracked or they were warped, and that's when the decision was made to replace almost all of it. And how we did that was we just merely took a new piece of white oak, and we laid it on a workbench, and you take one piece at a time off the boat, and you trace around that, and you rough cut it, and you put it on the boat, and you fair it to a general specification. Chines were a little bit harder. Those had to be, as I said earlier, soaked, and we started those. We mounted them at the bow first, and we screwed them very well and permanently anchored them, and then took long ropes, and because those 2 chines would stick out really wide, and we just started cranking them in. And as we would crank them in, we would fasten them onto frames as we came along. We didn't steam them. It would have made the process much easier, but the reason we did not steam is because then it would bend so easy that you would actually have flat spots in between the frames, more of a octagonal approach to the bow of the boat as opposed to a nice smooth sweeping action. Once all that framework was done, it was time to put skin on the boat, and because it was a Century and the bottom's basically flat as opposed to cupped, nothing really had to be steam bent on that boat. And but again, you start at the bow and you anchor that to your rivets that you've put into your keel and your chines, and you put a plank on, and you trim it. You make sure that it's exact duplicate of the original, and then you take that off and you finish it and you find it, and then you put it back on. And every plank comes on and off the boat about 3 times before it can be sealed and then permanently affixed to the boat. There's a dozen planks on the bottom, 6 on each side, a dozen planks on the sides, 6 on each side, and there's 4 on the transom. And there's about 8,000 screws that hold it all together. Each screw's got a little wooden plug, and which it gets installed where the grain follows the wood that it actually came out of. When I cut that plank, there was scrap, so that scrap is retained and it is marked for that particular plank. Then when plugs are needed for that plank at a later date, they're all cut out of that piece of wood so that the grain and that part of the tree all match, so there's not dotted finish in the end. And that all worked out really, really well. It was kind of mind-boggling and mind-bending at times. And there's a little celebratory picture I have of me putting in the last plug. It was quite the celebration. And that begins the sanding process. And the sanding is sanding and sanding and more sanding. You think you're done sanding, and then you discover there's more. But wait, there's more. So it's quite daunting. And there were 2 times in particular in which I really, really wanted to just walk away. I wanted to burn the garage and the boat and everything in it. And that was when, oddly enough, we had finished the bottom of the boat, we'd finished the sides, it was sealed, it had a good coat of varnish on it, and I had some people over and we flipped it upright. And I was so excited because I was thinking there was this light at the end of the tunnel. Well, once it became upright, it was really evident that all the deck work had to be done, and it was going to be months before I could do that. And it really, really hit me hard. and the only way to get over it is to get in and just do it. And the second time was after we had done the deck and we'd done all the primer and all the sanding, and I was ready for putting on the white paint. I had rented a spray booth. It was 30 miles away. I had to tow the boat for the first time for 30 miles, basically with nothing holding it on the trailer because I couldn't risk damaging the prep work. And we rented this booth, and the last thing I did was wipe everything down with a tack rag before we sprayed on a wonderful alkali finish, and I proceeded to do the worst paint job I've ever done in my whole life. And upon some inspection and some discovery, we found out that the tack rags that I used were polluted, and that everywhere they touched, which, trust me, was everywhere, it looked more like a football or a basketball finish than it did a nice clean surface. So all that really meant was that I was able to bring it back home and do more sanding. So we literally scraped some of the paint off because it was fresh until it was piles on the floor, and then resanded and reprimed and re-rented the spray booth and resprayed, and it turned out beautiful the second time around. And the second time we did use a polyurethane, and that was a much, much superior product. So but those were the two times that it was the worst. The top on the boat, this is a really unusual thing about the boat. In fact, as far as I know, it's the only wooden boat that was ever developed that has a fully functional, fully sliding top. A lot of Coronados had tops. Most of them were a stationary project with portions of them that slid out to buckle up against the windshield. But this one, the whole top moves back and forth. And I recently learned that there were some interesting things that happened along the way in the design of the top. I know that the artist's rendition of the top as original did not have a porthole in the back, but it was a full window in the back. And the actual subcontractor who produced the framework of the top, the people got together and they decided that they didn't like that back window, and they added a porthole. And the very first top that was delivered to the Century Boat Company, everybody fell in love with the porthole. So that became the norm. And that top in itself is probably about 300 pounds. It's 3 or 4 guys in a couple hours to install it. It can be removed, but it's not really designed to remove. It's designed to move fore and aft. But that top is built in a manner in which it's all brass 2-meter chassis. The inside of it is a perforated headliner, and that is attached first to some nailing strips that are affixed to the brass. Then the top is flipped upright for a real tight layer of very heavy canvas. On top of the heavy canvas is 1-inch thick boiler insulation. Boiler insulation was used because it does not retain any moisture, and should something happen to the boat where the top get really wet, they would want all the moisture to come out of it as quick as possible. Once that insulation is adhered to the canvas, then it's time for the white upholstery, and then it's time for the trim and the more screws and more trim and more screws, and then after that, of course, it's the plexiglass windows. Because of the compound curves, Century had no idea that they needed about 3 gentlemen or 3 men to stretch the acrylic over the buck, they called it, when it was hot. Traditionally, they had to just use 1 man who would pull a piece of plastic out of an oven, stretch it over the buck, clamp it down, and it was good. This one had to be stretched immediately in several different directions, so they had to employ more people just to get the job done, and a lot of people around the plant didn't particularly care for it. Let me start by saying that when the decision was made to want to pursue a boat like this, I actively started looking for somebody in a club or an organization that had one that I could go for a ride in one, because I had not been in one since I was 10 years old. All the memories I have are 10-year-old memories, and I could never find anybody. So when the boat was finished, the very first time out in it, I really did feel like a 10-year-old kid. I was giddy. I hadn't been in one, and it was absolutely a wonderful experience. The boat ran really well. And even my wife had never seen me that way, and I think that she was a little bit shocked when it came time to show my mom and my dad. And I did not mention earlier, but one of my brothers is a special needs man, and he has very, very fond memories of the boat. He was older than I was, and he drove the boat more, and he has stories of his own that he loves to tell. And we had planned a trip to go up to the St. Louis area and spend some time with my family out on the lake with the boat. And it was an unbelievable experience, and the things that were communicated to me by strangers and by my family was just stuff that has changed my life. I remember in particular my special needs brother, the first time he saw it, he just stood on the dock and he stared and he shook his head, and I let him soak it in. And I asked him, I said, "Tom, what do you think?" And he just shook his head and he says, "Jim, I think it's better than Grandpa's boat ever was. It's beautiful." My dad is talking to me on the phone about it almost on a weekly basis, and he's almost in tears. The things that, the honor that he feels about honoring his dad because his son has restored a boat like his dad's, is just, it's things and it's memories that I never really knew anybody was experiencing other than myself. I did this because it was something I wanted to do. I had no idea that it would be the bonding experience for our whole family that it has been. It is absolutely amazing. But my mom continually comments that it's the most beautiful boat she's ever seen all her days. And it's sad to think that my grandfather and my grandmother are no longer with us to share it, but it is often the subject of conversation, and it's neat.